Throughout the field of Appalachian studies, scholars have traced the portrayal of Appalachian culture in mediums such as literature and television and film, but very few have looked at its portrayal in the dramatic arts, and none of them have looked at its portrayal in opera. Thus, for my master's thesis, I sought to answer the question, how is Appalachian culture portrayed in the operas Savannah and Cold Mountain? These operas were written and premiered 60 years apart, but they're both set in southern Appalachia, and they both share many overlapping themes in regards to gender roles, religious beliefs, and depictions of violence in the Appalachian region. And a large portion of this study involved me interviewing people who had been involved in these operas in some capacity. I spoke to 7 people overall, a costume designer, a director, a musical composer, and 4 vocalists who had all been involved in one or both of the operas at some point. And it was very interesting because only one of my 7 participants actually identifies as an Appalachian. So 6 out of my 7 participants view themselves as being outside the realm of Appalachia and are not necessarily familiar with the culture because they haven't lived or spent large amounts of time in the region. And even though I received a diverse set of responses to these interview questions where I asked them about their familiarity with Appalachian culture and if they could name or expand upon any types of Appalachian stereotypes, I did notice recurring assumptions of homogeneous morality, religious beliefs, political beliefs, levels of education, levels of economic class, gender identities, and racial identities in the region. And it surprised me because many of my participants were not aware of how expansive and diverse the Appalachian region really is. According to the Appalachian Regional Commission, which is a federal initiative that has been active since 1965, the Appalachian region is comprised of portions of 13 states. Over 26 million people live in Appalachia, equating to almost 8% of this country's population. And yet, historically, in media and entertainment, Appalachian characters have been presented and depicted pretty monolithically. Appalachian characters are almost always white, they're poor, they're uneducated, they're hyper-aggressive, and what's more is that there are absolutely gender norms that Appalachian characters are tied to. For example, as opposed to the standard American family, that's often presented in media, Appalachian male characters tend to be presented as lazy and unreliable. There are strong ties to alcoholism and substance abuse and hyperaggression. Whereas the females in families are often presented as being matriarchal. They're the ones overcompensating for the men in the household because the men are not doing the work. And so Appalachian women are always depicted as being gritty and self-sufficient and very reliant on their own strength. And so naturally, as I dove into these stereotypical studies that have actually been accounted for in literature and television and film, I wanted to know if they showed up in the operas that I was studying. And the answer to that question was a bit more complex than I think I originally anticipated. Yes, there absolutely are characters in both operas that check off all of these boxes. For example, in the opera Savannah, the character Sam Polk, who is the older brother of the main character Susanna Polk, he is implicitly described as being unreliable and lazy. He is an implied alcoholic, and spoiler alert, at the end of the opera, he murders somebody. And in Cold Mountain, there's the character Teague, who is the leader of the Home Guard during the Civil War, and his language is explicitly aggressive, it's violent, it's sexist, it's racist, and the opera opens with him murdering somebody. So these ties to violence and male characters in particular are very strong in both of the operas. But I was also taken aback and pleasantly surprised by characters who went above and beyond these stereotypical depictions of Appalachia. And one of my favorite examples of this is the relationship between Ada and Ruby in the opera Cold Mountain. Now, some of you may be familiar with the novel Cold Mountain that was written and published in 1997 by Charles Fraser and later became a film in the early 2000s. The opera is much more recent. It was written and premiered in 2015, but the storyline is inspired by that novel, and which later became a film. And in the opera, you have 2 storylines that are happening at the same time, and one of those storylines is the story of Ada Monroe. Ada is not native to Cold Mountain in the Appalachian region. We learned that she grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and she moved to Cold Mountain with her father. And then at the onset of the Civil War, her lover leaves for battle and her father dies, and she is left alone on this farm, and she doesn't know how to survive. It's implied that she's received a scholarly education and she's very refined, and she's kind of that trope of the standard American urban woman of the time period. But she doesn't know how to grow her own food, and it's assumed that she might not live to see the end of the war when her lover returns. Then we meet Ruby Fuse, who meets Ada by crossing her land one day, and Ruby fits that trope of the stereotypical Appalachian woman. She has a very thick accent, she's lived in Cold Mountain her entire life, and she's lived her entire life alone due to parental abandonment. She's incredibly self-reliant, she's strong, she's gritty, and she knows the land like the back of her hand. So she meets Ada, and she decides that she's going to offer to live with Ada and teach her what she knows so that Ada can survive and thrive. And I really love their relationship for two reasons. One is because when we're introduced to these two characters, like I've explained, they both kind of fit these tropes, right? We have the standard urban American woman of the time period who's refined and genteel, and we have this gritty Appalachian woman who's the total opposite of Ada in every way. But their backgrounds and their regional identities don't matter for very long. In fact, they totally dissipate and they become pretty irrelevant to the story because all that matters is that they're working together to survive. And their relationship begins in kind of an awkward, unsettling way. They don't know each other, but they become best friends, and they're still friends, surviving and thriving at the end of the opera, which I love. I also love their relationship because the language explicitly states that they are aware that they are defying the gender norms of the period, which I find very empowering. They describe their farm work and their work outside as they're bringing the farm back to life as being men's work. That term is thrown around a lot in the book and in the opera. So they are aware that what they're doing is not considered normal or common for their gender in that time period. But they have to do what they have to do to survive, right? And so it doesn't matter what their gender are, and it doesn't matter what their backgrounds are. They work together, and they become friends. And I find their resilience just incredibly empowering and inspiring. So I bring these stories, these operas and characters to you today because I believe they're wonderful examples of challenging the narrative. And one of the best ways that they challenge narratives and stereotypes perpetuated by narratives is by embracing and celebrating marginalized joy. For example, Appalachia as a region is typically depicted in news coverage and in entertainment forums as being a place of struggle and pain and strife and sadness. And there's no use in me standing up here and denying that those feelings and those responses to traumatic events and traumatic histories is invalid, because a lot of awful things have happened in the Appalachian region and to the Appalachian region, but this region also exists and is a host to beautiful landscapes and progressive activists and strong communities and really kind, fantastic people. And I'm disappointed that we're not seeing more of that in the news, and we're not seeing more of that in media. And I think the same can be said to a lot of marginalized demographics. It's always about the fight and the struggle and the grit. And I think that we should be honoring that while also celebrating the joy and the happiness and the beauty. And I think that Susanna Polk and Ruby Fuse and Ada Monroe are great tributes to this idea of celebrating marginalized joy and challenging narratives. Because stereotypes and the narratives that are perpetuated by stereotypes, they affect every single one of us, whether you identify as Appalachian or not in this room. Stereotypes shape who we are, how we present ourselves to the world, and how we see ourselves, but they also shape our demographic identities. We feel like we need to be or should be a certain way oftentimes because of our gender identity or our race or our abilities or the level of economic class that we fall into. When in reality, we have at any time the choice to stand outside of these stereotypes and these narratives, to challenge them and to say, no, this is who I want to be. We are each uniquely beautiful individual humans, and at any time, at any point, We can walk out the door tonight and say, this is who I want to be, regardless of my gender or my race or my sexual orientation. So tonight, as you leave this event, or even now as you're sitting at your table, I hope you feel encouraged and empowered to challenge the narrative and to feel compelled to encourage media and consume media that includes characters that rise above and beyond stereotypes. Thank you.